For more than 20 years, I worked as a janitor in a small cafe on the corner of Main and Sycamore in Charleston, South Carolina. Nobody there ever asked for my full name, and I preferred it that way. Everyone just called me Mr. Joe. I had my routine: show up before sunrise, brew the first pot of coffee, wipe down the tables, restock the sugar and creamer, and keep my head low. I smiled politely, answered when spoken to, but never lingered too long. My role was simple, quiet, invisible. I suppose I became part of the wallpaper over the years. People came and went, college students with earbuds, old couples with their weekend crossword puzzles, mums with strollers and lattes, and me, the quiet old man with the grey mustache and the steady hands. No one knew who I really was. No one ever asked. Until one ordinary afternoon, something shifted. A college girl from the nearby campus dropped her history textbook on the floor as she fumbled with her bag. I walked over, intending to help pick it up, a simple gesture. But then I saw her freeze as she opened the book. Her eyes locked onto a page, wide with disbelief. She turned to me slowly, holding the book up like it was some sacred relic. "Is this you? In this photo?" I looked down, and there it was, that photo. I hadn't seen it in decades, but I recognized it instantly. A black and white image from 1944. 3 soldiers standing among the rubble of a bombed-out Italian village, hoisting an American flag over the wreckage. One of those soldiers, the one in the middle with the dirt on his face and the bandage on his hand, was me, 19 years old, just a kid. I felt my breath catch in my throat. My first instinct was to deny it, say it wasn't me, say she was mistaken. But I couldn't. My hands started to tremble. The rag I'd been holding slipped to the floor. She didn't say anything more. She didn't have to. Her eyes said it all, so I just nodded. Once, and with that, a silence I had kept buried for nearly 80 years, finally began to speak. If this story touches you the way it touched me to write it, hit that like button and subscribe. It helps us share more stories that move, inspire, and surprise. And now, get ready, because what comes next will change everything. The photo in that history book was taken in July 1944, just outside Anzio, Italy. I was 19 years old. My uniform was muddy, my helmet slightly tilted, and my left hand was wrapped in gauze. I'd sliced it open crawling under barbed wire the night before. I was serving in the 36th Infantry Division of the U.S. Army. That particular shot was snapped by a war correspondent right after our unit helped liberate a small village. In the photo, I'm standing beside 2 fellow soldiers, men whose names are etched deeper into my memory than my own reflection. CPL Ray Peterson from Ohio and Pivot Luis Morales from El Paso, Texas. We weren't posing. Hell, we didn't even know the guy had a camera. We were just exhausted, dirty, and full of that strange, fleeting kind of relief that only comes after surviving another push. Ray had just finished tying a tattered American flag to a broken piece of pipe. Luis found a half-buried milk crate to stand on so we could get the flag up high. I remember the wind catching it just for a second. That flap of cloth against the ruins felt like defiance, like a promise that maybe this war wouldn't swallow everything. That photo, it ended up in newspapers. Later, it made its way into textbooks and documentaries. They called it Raising the Flag in Anzio. Some compared it to Iwo Jima, though we all knew ours was smaller, dirtier, quieter. No names were listed, no credits. Just 3 anonymous faces representing the American push through Italy. And that suited me just fine. Because when the war ended, I didn't want to be remembered. I didn't want medals or parades. I just wanted to disappear. Not out of shame, never that, but because I was tired. Tired in a way that doesn't go away with sleep. Tired of death, of shouting, of waiting for letters that didn't come. Most of all, tired of loss. You see, while I was carrying a rifle through Europe, I was also carrying something else, letters, dozens of them, from her. Her name was Eleanor, and she was my world before the war tore it apart. We'd grown up 2 streets away from each other in Savannah, Georgia. She used to sneak peaches from her father's tree and hand them to me through the fence. I kissed her the first time under the magnolia tree behind her house, right before shipping out. She gave me a silver chain with a tiny cross on it and made me promise I'd come home. I wrote her every week, sometimes more. She wrote back, always. Her letters smelled faintly of rosewater and had little pressed violets tucked into them, sometimes a ribbon, sometimes a Bible verse. She'd tell me about her day, hanging laundry, singing in church, volunteering at the Red Cross. It was those letters that kept me sane. They reminded me who I was when the uniform started to feel more real than my own skin. We had plans, big ones, a white house, a wraparound porch, a piano in the parlor. We were going to get married in the spring of '46, right after I got back. She sent me fabric samples for her dress. I sent her photos of Naples and Florence, trying to imagine showing her the world someday, in peace. But peace never came for us. When the war ended, I went to the last address I had for her, a small house in a quiet street in Savannah, but the door was boarded up. The neighbors said the family had moved. No one knew where. I sent letters, dozens of them. Each one came back stamped, undeliverable. No forwarding address. Return to sender. I asked around, checked churches, went to the Red Cross. No trace. Some said she'd gotten married while I was away. Others said she'd taken ill. A few suggested she moved up north, but no one really knew, and I never found out. All I had left were her letters, the cross she gave me, and a tiny photograph of her sitting on a swing, smiling like the world had no shadows. And so I stopped searching, not because I didn't care, but because not knowing eventually felt easier than hoping. I tucked her memory deep inside me, sealed with silence. I told no one about her, not even Ray or Luis, before they were killed weeks apart near the Po Valley. After I returned home, I drifted, did some odd jobs, took work where names didn't matter and questions weren't asked. Eventually, I found my way here, to this little cafe, where I could wipe tables, restock sugar, and never have to explain myself. And yet every morning as I wiped down the glass windows, I would catch a glimpse of my reflection, and behind those tired eyes, I could still see him, that 19-year-old boy who raised a flag in the ruins, who once loved someone so deeply that no battlefield could bury it. He was always there, and I did everything I could to keep him hidden. Sometimes I think those letters were the only reason I made it back alive. Not my training, not my instincts, not even luck. Just her handwriting, those folded pages that arrived every few weeks, smelling faintly of rosewater and Georgia clay. They were my breath when the air around me turned to gunpowder, my sanity when my thoughts were falling apart like shrapnel, my faith when my God felt too far away. I met Eleanor when we were kids, barefoot, sunburned, sneaking cold sweet tea from the porch during hot Savannah summers. She had wild curls and a crooked front tooth that she hated, but I loved. By the time we were 16, we were walking home from church holding hands. By 17, we were making promises we couldn't yet understand. And by 18, I was kissing her goodbye at the train station with the draft notice in my coat pocket. She was the one who told me to write. "Just a page a week," she said, "so I'll know your heart's still beating." And I did. I wrote from boot camp in Mississippi, from the troop ship crossing the Atlantic, from a foxhole in Sicily, from a burnt-out farmhouse in Italy. I wrote with frozen fingers and shaking hands, under flickering lanterns, and during long, quiet nights when sleep wouldn't come. And she wrote back. God, how she wrote back. Her letters were always written in blue ink, always signed, "Yours, Eleanor," and they always carried something inside. A sprig of lavender, a line of scripture, a pressed petal from the magnolia tree in her backyard. Once she sent me a swatch of the fabric she was planning to use for her wedding dress, ivory satin. I tucked it into my breast pocket and carried it through half of Europe. Even when it got dirty and creased, I never took it out. It felt like armor, soft, useless, beautiful armor. She told me about her days, working shifts at the Red Cross, helping her father rebuild their porch, learning to bake bread from scratch, not from mix, because you deserve something real when you come home. She wrote about the neighborhood, the weather, the hens in the yard, and sometimes about fear, about how long the nights felt without me, about how the radio made her stomach turn every time it mentioned Italy, and in every letter she ended with the same line, "Come home to me, Joe. I don't care when or how, just come home." I never stopped imagining it, stepping off that train, running up the front steps, finding her on the porch with her arms open. That thought kept me alive through mortar fire, through trench rot, through the kind of grief that made your bones ache. I had plans. We had plans. A little white house on the edge of town, a piano in the living room, kids with names we'd picked out at 17, James if it was a boy, Margaret if a girl, but life doesn't follow plans, especially not in war. In April 1945, as the front finally began to quiet, I mailed her what would be my longest letter, 6 full pages. I wrote about everything, the relief, the guilt, the boys we lost, the prayer I whispered when I realized I might actually survive. I told her I was coming home, that it was almost over, that I still carried the cross she gave me, and the photo she sent tucked behind my dog tags. I told her I hadn't stopped dreaming about her, not even once. And then, silence. Weeks passed, then a month. No reply, no letter, no lavender. I told myself maybe the mail was slow, maybe something got lost, maybe she was just waiting until I got home to tell me something in person. But when I finally got back stateside, the first thing I did was head for Savannah. I didn't even stop at the Army Processing Center. I just took a bus and walked the last 3 blocks to her house, still wearing half my uniform. The porch swing was gone, the shutters were closed, and the mailbox had a new name I didn't recognize. A neighbor, old and stooped, came out to water her hydrangeas and looked me up and down. "You looking for the Mitchells?" she asked. "Yes, Mom," I said. "Eleanor Mitchell." She paused. "They moved, son, over a year ago now, didn't say where." That was all. I knocked on doors, I went to the church, I wrote letters to everyone I could think of. I asked the Red Cross. I even spoke to the Postal Service. Nothing. No forwarding address, no trace, just absence. Heavy and echoing. And that's how it ended. With no goodbye, no explanation, no final word. I don't know if she married someone else, if she left town, if she died. I don't know if she kept my letters or burned them, if she thought I was gone, or if she chose to let me go. The truth never found its way back to me. I kept her letters, though, all of them. Wrapped in a ribbon, tucked in a box that smells of dust and old ink. I've read them so many times the creases are permanent. The words are fading, but they're still there. So is her photo, black and white, smiling in the sun, hair curled just right, sitting on that porch swing before the world turned upside down. I carry it in my wallet, still, even now. And I still wear the chain she gave me, under my shirt close to my heart. I've lived a long time since then. I've cleaned tables, swept floors, mopped corners. I've laughed a little and aged a lot, but I never loved anyone else. Not like that. Not the way you love someone when the world is ending and their words are the only thing that keeps you alive. Some things you just carry forever. When I came back from the war, I didn't tell anyone. No parades, no banners, no welcome home. I stepped off a train in Charleston in the middle of the night with a duffel bag slung over my shoulder and dust in my throat that no amount of water could wash away. No one met me. No one expected me. I remember looking around the station, hearing the distant sound of a jazz trio playing in some late-night bar, and thinking the world had gone on without me. And maybe that was a good thing, because the man who returned wasn't the same one who'd left. I rented a room in a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Thomas, who didn't ask questions. She handed me a key, pointed to the bathroom down the hall, and told me dinner was served at 6. I nodded and thanked her. That was the first real conversation I had in weeks. I worked odd jobs at first, unloading crates at the port, painting houses in the suburbs, fixing fences and hauling garbage. I kept my head down. I didn't tell anyone I'd been in the army. Didn't mention Anzio or Rome or the friends I buried beneath Italian soil. I didn't talk about Eleanor. I didn't even think about trying to find out what really happened to her. Because silence, as I had learned, could be warm. It could be safe. Eventually, I walked into that cafe on Main Street. The manager asked if I had any experience cleaning. I said yes. He said to come back the next day. And I did. I never left. 23 years. Every morning before dawn, I'd unlock the door, turn on the lights, and start wiping down the tables. I'd polish the glass, restock the sugars, make the first pot of coffee. Then I'd disappear into the rhythm of the place, like clockwork, like background noise, like a ghost. They called me Mr. Joe. That was all anyone knew. The regulars would nod at me. Some smiled. I smiled back. Polite. Distant. I never gave them a reason to ask more. Never told them I once held a rifle tighter than I've ever held another person's hand, that I once dug trenches with fingers blistered and bleeding, that I knew the sound a man makes when he dies, not in a movie but for real. I kept it all inside because silence became my shield, my armor, my language. Talking meant remembering. Remembering meant hurting. And hurting, well, I'd done enough of that. Sometimes people would ask if I had family. I'd shrug. Not really, I'd say, and change the subject. If they asked where I was from, I'd lie, little lies, safe lies. Up north or the coast, nothing specific, nothing that could lead to anything more. I got good at disappearing in plain sight. I used to think of that boy in the photo, the 19-year-old soldier hoisting a flag in a ruined town, as someone else entirely. He had fire in his eyes, hope, dirt on his face, and a reason to fight. I'd see his reflection sometimes, faintly, in the window as I cleaned, but I didn't invite him back in. I buried that version of me. Not because I hated him, but because I didn't know how to carry him anymore. The war didn't end for me in 45. It just changed shape. It became quiet. It became paperwork, rent, bills, stiff knees, and long silences at dinner. It became that photo of Eleanor I kept folded in my wallet, that cross around my neck, the dreams that came in waves. Some nights she was there in her Sunday dress, waving from the porch. Other nights I was back in the mud, trying to hold a wound closed that wouldn't stop bleeding. And the cafe became my hiding place. It was small, predictable, clean. There were no landmines, no blood, no loss, just dishes, steam, laughter I didn't have to join. I didn't mind being invisible. I'd already learned how to disappear. In war and now in peace, some folks look at silence as emptiness, but for me, silence was control. Silence was peace. At least that's what I told myself. The morning after that girl asked me if the photo in her textbook was me, I thought about not going back to work, just disappearing again. I'd done it once. I knew how. A bus ride, a different city, a new name. It would have been easy, but something in her eyes, that look, that quiet insistence, stayed with me. It wasn't just curiosity, it was reverence, respect, like she'd stumbled across something sacred. And maybe for the first time in my life, I felt like telling the truth wouldn't break me. So I showed up to the cafe, like always. But this time, I wore the shirt with the small tear in the collar. The one I'd gotten in Italy, the one Eleanor said made me look like a real man. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted something of her near me. Maybe I needed her courage. She came back that afternoon, not alone. With her was an older man, tweed jacket, soft eyes, a leather-bound notebook in hand. He introduced himself as Dr. Alan Reeves, a history professor from the local university. He said he'd seen the photo dozens of times over the years, in lectures, on slides, in archives. And yet, he said, I never imagined I'd meet the man behind it. I tried to laugh it off, said it must be a coincidence, but they weren't buying it. Dr. Reeves opened his notebook and read out names, units, movements, dates that lined up too perfectly. Then he said my name, my real name, and I froze. Joseph Edwin Carter, he said softly. Private First Class, 36th Infantry Division. No one had said my full name in decades. Something inside me cracked open. I took a deep breath. And then, for the first time in over 70 years, I spoke the whole truth. About Anzio, about Ray and Luis, about Eleanor, about the letters and the photo and the cross around my neck. I told them things I hadn't told my own reflection. And they listened, not with judgment, but with awe, as if my pain had weight, as if my silence had mattered. That night, I pulled out the old tin box I'd kept buried at the back of my closet. Inside were the letters, her handwriting, her pressed flowers. I hadn't touched them in years. I sat there reading each one again like scripture. 2 days later, I was on the local news. Unknown veteran identified in iconic "We Too" photo, the headline said. People started stopping me on the street. The mayor sent a thank you note. A group of students brought me a handmade card that said, "We remember you, Mr. Carter." It was overwhelming. But it wasn't the media that changed my life. It was a letter. It came the following week. A simple white envelope, no return address, just my name, written in handwriting that was careful and slow. Inside was a single page. It read, "My name is Claire. My mother was Eleanor. I was born in 1946. The room spun. I read the line over and over, my fingers trembling so badly the paper crinkled in my hands. I sat down hard and just wept, not like a soldier, not like an old man, but like the boy who'd never gotten to say goodbye. Claire, Eleanor's daughter, my daughter. She asked to meet, said she'd grown up hearing stories about a man who wrote letters from war, a kind man, a brave man. A man her mother never stopped loving. I always thought he was a myth, she wrote, but now I know he was real. We met in the park. She was in her late 70s, elegant, with grey hair tucked neatly behind her ears, and eyes that were unmistakably Eleanor's. She showed me a photo, a black and white picture of her mother holding a baby on a sunlit porch, and there she was, my Eleanor, smiling, alive. Claire told me everything, that Eleanor had been relocated north during the war, that she tried to find me, wrote letters for years, but was told I'd never returned, that she raised Claire alone, never remarried, never stopped hoping. She kept your letters in a silk pouch, Claire said. She read them to me when I was little. She said, "Your father was a good man." I couldn't speak, I just cried. I held her hand, my daughter's hand, and in that moment I felt time fold in on itself, as if the decades between us had never existed. I whispered, "I'm sorry." She just smiled. "You came back," she said. "That's all that matters." Claire and I meet once a week now, usually on Sundays. Sometimes we sit in the park, sometimes at the cafe, always with 2 cups of black coffee, no sugar, just like Eleanor used to drink it. We talk about simple things. About her grandkids, her garden, the old dog she rescued from a shelter. But every so often she'll ask something about the war, about her mother, about me, and I tell her, not everything, but enough. Enough for her to know who I was, and who I've become. She calls me Dad, not Joseph, not Mr. Carter, just Dad. The first time she said it, it landed like a prayer, soft, sacred, healing. She told me Eleanor never gave up on me, that she believed, until the day she died, that I was still out there, that one day, somehow, the world would find a way to put us back together, even if she wouldn't be there to see it. Claire said she used to tell me he was the kind of man who doesn't just disappear. I think about that often now, because for a long time, that's exactly what I tried to do, disappear. I thought it was easier to fade away than to carry the weight of everything I lost. I thought that by staying silent, I was protecting myself. But really, I was just waiting to be found, waiting for someone to care enough to ask, that someone was a college girl with a history book, a photo, and a question. Today, the name tag on my apron no longer says Mr. Joe. It says Joseph E. Carter. Veteran, father, survivor, customers still come and go. The cafe still smells like cinnamon and espresso, but something's different now. They know who I am. They nod with a little more respect. Some shake my hand. One boy, maybe 12, told me he wanted to be brave like me when he grew up. I smiled. I told him, bravery isn't about what you do in war. It's about what you choose to do after. I still keep Eleanor's letters. They're a little more fragile now. The paper has yellowed, the ink has faded, but the words are alive. And I keep one photo of her in my wallet, that same one, on the porch swing, eyes full of light. Right next to it I carry a new photo. It's of me and Claire sitting on that same porch. 2 rocking chairs, 2 generations, 1 heart, finally whole again. And sometimes, in the quiet of early morning when the cafe is still empty and the first sunlight filters through the blinds, I close my eyes and whisper, "Thank you." Not for the fame, not for the attention, but for the chance to finish the story I thought ended in silence. We share stories like this every day, true stories that move, heal, and remind us of the strength in love and memory. Leave a comment below if this one touched your heart.